The wind carried dust across the plain like a living thing, whispering through bronze scales and leather straps. Somewhere in the distance, a war horn moaned, low, patient, merciless. 10,000 men stood in silence, their breath fogging the dawn air, their shadows stretching long behind them like ghosts already mourning what was to come. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the Immortals, boots pressed into the soil of Anatolia, as shields were lifted and lowered one final time. The clink of metal echoed softly, controlled, disciplined, deliberate. No shouting, no panic, only the sound of men who had trained their fear into obedience. A young warrior named Artanes tightened the strap of his shield, his fingers trembling despite himself. He glanced sideways at the man beside him, older, scarred, eyes empty of illusion. "Do you think they know who we are?" Artanes whispered. The veteran did not turn his head. "They will," he said quietly, "before the sun reaches its highest point." Behind them, the standard of the Achaemenid Empire stirred, golden, heavy, eternal. Beyond the ridge lay enemy cities that had dared to resist the King of Kings. Ionian rebels, Greek mercenaries, men who believed freedom could survive against an empire that stretched from the Indus to the Aegean. A drum sounded once. Then again, boom, boom. The rhythm was slow, meant to calm the heart, not quicken it. Armor creaked as the Immortals formed ranks. Spears angled forward like a forest growing teeth. Quivers were checked. Bowstrings drawn and released once, twice, to test their song. In the rear ranks, officers moved silently, counting not men but absence. If one Immortal fell, another would step forward. 10,000 today, 10,000 tomorrow. Always, that was the legend. But legends did not bleed. Men did. A scout came running from the ridge, breath ragged, dust caked into his beard. "They are forming shields," he gasped. "Heavy infantry. Greeks." A murmur rippled through the line, quickly smothered by discipline. Greeks meant close combat. Greeks meant crushed bones and screaming steel. Greeks meant the kind of fighting where courage was measured in how long you stayed standing. Artanes swallowed hard. Somewhere far behind, siege engines groaned as they were hauled into place. To the south, Persian ships cut through the coastal waters, sails snapping in the wind, Marines ready to strike harbor defenses once the land battle began. Empire moved like a machine, land and sea bound together by command and purpose. The Immortals were its blade. The drums stopped. Silence fell so heavy it pressed against the ears. Then, a Greek trumpet screamed from across the field. Arrows rose into the sky in answer, darkening the morning light. They fell like rain, hissing, thudding into shields and flesh. Men screamed. Orders rang out in Old Persian, sharp, precise, unyielding. "Advance!" The ground shook as 10,000 feet moved as one. Spears clashed against shields. Bronze rang like thunder. Dust swallowed the sun. Artanes felt the impact before he saw it. A Greek shield slamming into his own, driving air from his lungs. He stabbed blindly, felt resistance, warmth. The man in front of him fell, eyes wide in disbelief. There was no time to think, only to fight. Behind him, another Immortal stepped forward to fill a fallen gap without hesitation. The line never broke. It bent, it groaned, but it held. And as blood soaked into the soil of Asia Minor, the myth of the Immortals collided with the brutal truth of war. They were not gods. They were men trained to die so an empire could live. The sun climbed higher. The battle had only just begun. The shouting grew louder as the two lines locked together, a grinding wall of flesh and iron that refused to yield. Shields slammed, spear shafts splintered, and the air filled with the wet, choking smell of blood and sweat. Orders were shouted and swallowed by the roar of battle, replaced by instinct, fear, and the desperate will to survive. Artanes stumbled as a body collapsed at his feet. He barely had time to register the man's face. Persian young, eyes already glazing, before another Immortal slid seamlessly into the empty space. 10,000. Always 10,000. The formation absorbed death without hesitation. But the knowledge that someone must replace the fallen pressed heavily on every man's mind. "Hold the line!" An officer shouted behind them, his voice cracking like a whip. For the king, the Greeks surged forward in disciplined waves, bronze helmets flashing in the sun. Their hoplites fought shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, pushing as one mass. Every step forward cost them blood, but they did not break. Not yet. Arrows hissed overhead as Persian archers loosed from behind the Immortals' ranks, the sound like tearing cloth. Some found their mark, thuds followed by screams, but many clattered harmlessly against Greek shields. The enemy adapted quickly, angling their defenses, pressing closer to deny the archers their advantage. Artane's arms burned. His shield felt impossibly heavy. Each clash sent a shock through his bones. A Greek spear slid past his guard, slicing into his thigh. Pain flared white-hot. He cried out, but did not fall. The older warrior beside him noticed at once. "Stay upright," he growled, slamming his shield forward to create space. "Pain means you're alive." They advance again, step by brutal step. From the rear, the immortal commanders watched with narrowed eyes. The Greeks were holding longer than expected. This was no rabble of rebels. These were men hardened by constant war, by city-states that demanded everything from their citizens. A signal horn sounded, short, sharp. The Immortals shifted formation, opening narrow lanes between units. Light infantry rushed forward, hurling javelins into exposed Greek flanks. The sudden attack drew cries of alarm. Shields twisted. Lines faltered. "Now!" came the order. Persian cavalry thundered in from the right, hooves pounding like rolling thunder. Dust exploded upward as horsemen crashed into the Greek side, curved blades flashing. The sound of breaking bone carried even over the screams. For a moment, it seemed the battle would tip decisively. Artanes felt hope rise in his chest. Dangerous, fragile. Then the Greeks countered. A disciplined reserve surged forward. Spears angled low. Horses screamed as they impaled themselves on the bristling wall. Riders tumbled, crushed beneath hooves and shields. The cavalry attack stalled, then broke away in chaos. The field was a nightmare. Bodies lay tangled together, Persian and Greek indistinguishable beneath blood and dust. Flies already gathered. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning armor into ovens. A lull followed, not peace, but exhaustion. Artanes leaned on his spear, chest heaving. His thigh throbbed, blood soaking into the ground. He looked around and realized how many faces were gone. Men he had marched beside for weeks, replaced without ceremony. The veteran beside him wiped his blade clean on a fallen cloak. "This is what victory costs," he said quietly. "Remember their faces. The king never will." The words struck harder than any blow. A new horn sounded, long, low. The Greeks were withdrawing, not fleeing, not broken, pulling back in order. Shields raised, wounded dragged behind them. They had lost ground, but not their will. They vanished toward the hills, leaving the field littered with the price of resistance. The Immortals did not pursue. They stood in silence as the dust settled, counting the dead, not with voices, but with movement. One man stepped forward for every body carried away. The line was restored. 10,000 again. As night crept across the battlefield, fires flickered to life. The wounded moaned. Priests moved among the fallen, murmuring prayers for souls claimed by the earth. Somewhere in the distance, waves crashed against the shore where Persian ships waited, ready for the next phase of war. Artane sat alone, staring at his blood-stained hands. They had not lost, but neither had they truly won. He understood now what it meant to be immortal. Not that death could not touch them, but that it would never be allowed to slow the Empire's march. And tomorrow, the war would demand more. The darkness deepened. So did the cost. Morning came without mercy. The sun rose red over the hills, as if the sky itself remembered the blood spilled the day before. Campfires smoldered low, sending thin fingers of smoke into the still air. The wounded had not slept. Neither had the men who listened to their cries. Artanes forced himself to stand when the horn sounded. His thigh had been bound tight with linen, stiff and aching, but he said nothing. Among the Immortals, pain was private. Weakness was a luxury reserved for the dead. Across the camp, armor was lifted, adjusted, repaired. Dent by dent, Scratch by scratch, men prepared themselves again. The sound of whetstones against steel carried to the morning like an insect hum, steady, patient, ominous. The veteran from the day before knelt beside Artanes, tightening his own greaves. "They'll try the hills today," he said. "Greeks always do." Artanes nodded. He had heard the same whispers, moving through the ranks. High ground, narrow passes, places where numbers mattered less than courage and discipline. A messenger arrived at a run, bowing low before the immortal commanders. Orders followed swiftly. The army would advance inland, pressing the enemy toward the rain they believed favored them. The king's strategy was clear. Let the Greeks choose their ground, then break them upon it. Columns formed, banners lifted. The march began. The path narrowed as they moved into the foothills. Trees closed in, their leaves whispering in the breeze. The air grew cooler, damp with the smell of earth and stone. Birds scattered at the approach of thousands of armored men. Then came the first scream. A Persian scout tumbled from the rocks above, an arrow buried in his throat. Shouts erupted. Shields snapped up as stones and javelins rained down from hidden positions. The Greeks had set their trap well. "Ambush!" someone cried. The Immortals reacted instantly. Formation tightened. Archers loosened to the ridgelines, arrows vanishing into foliage. The sound of which striking flesh echoed back in answer. Greek warriors burst from concealment, charging downhill with ferocious cries. Their momentum was terrifying. Shields smashed into Persian lines, sending men stumbling. The narrow ground compressed the Immortals, denying them space to maneuver. Artanes found himself driven backward, boots slipping on loose gravel. A Greek lunged at him, eyes wild, beard matted with sweat. Their spears tangled. Artanes wrenched his free and stabbed upward, feeling the impact jar his arm. The man collapsed, dragging Artanes down with him. For a heartbeat, Artanes lay pinned beneath the body, gasping, the smell of iron and earth filling his lungs. A shadow loomed, another Greek, raising his sword. Steel flashed. The older Immortal stood over him, blade dripping. He hauled Artanes to his feet, without a word. "Stay close," he said. "They want us scattered." The fighting became savage, intimate. There were no sweeping maneuvers here. Only inches gained and lost. Only strength against strength. Command dissolved into shouts. The clangor of metal echoed off the rocks, magnifying the chaos. Then the signal horn sounded again, 3 sharp blasts. From the rear, Persian slingers advanced, their weapons whirling overhead. Stones flew with deadly force, cracking helmets, breaking limbs. Greek momentum slowed. Confusion spread. The Immortals pressed forward, shields locked, pushing uphill now, reclaiming ground inch by bloody inch. The Greeks fought fiercely, but gravity no longer favored them. A final Persian horn sounded, long and commanding. The Greeks disengaged, melting back into the forest, carrying their wounded and dead. Silence returned to hills, broken only by labored breathing and the groans of the injured. Artanes leaned against a tree, hands shaking. He realized he'd been screaming during the fight, not in fear, but in rage. The sound still rang in his ears. The veteran wiped his face and looked toward the retreating enemy. "They learn," he said. "Every battle makes them smarter." Artanes stared after the Greeks, understanding dawning slowly. So did the Immortals. So did the Empire. Each victory carved deeper scars, demanded sharper edges. This war was not a single clash. It was a test of endurance, of which people could suffer longer without breaking. As the Immortals reformed their ranks once more, counting the fallen with silent steps, Artanes felt something harden inside him. The boy who had marched out beneath the Empire's banner was fading. What remained was a soldier shaped by hills, blood, and the unrelenting will of history. And the war was still far from over. The march slowed after the hills, not from caution, but from exhaustion. Armor scraped against bruised shoulders, and every step stirred aches that had settled deep into bone. The Immortals moved like a wounded animal, still deadly, still disciplined, but carrying the weight of continuous battle. By midday, the scouts returned with troubling news. The Greeks had regrouped near a river crossing ahead, a place where water narrowed the field and forced armies to confront each other head-on. Wooden palisades had been thrown together in haste. Shields glittered behind them. They were preparing to stand. The immortal commanders studied the terrain in silence. The river flowed fast, its surface broken by rocks that churned white foam. Crossing it under enemy eyes would be costly. Yet delay would invite more resistance, more cities emboldened by rumors of Persian casualties. The order came without ceremony. Advance. Persian engineers moved first, wading into the water, anchoring ropes against the current. Arrows immediately followed, Greek shafts streaking down like angry birds. Men cried out as bodies were swept away, armor dragging them under. The Immortal stepped forward. Cold water slammed into Artane's legs, stealing his breath. The current tugged at his wounded thigh, pain flaring anew. He clenched his jaw and pressed on, shield raised as arrows rattled against bronze. "Keep moving," officers shouted. "Do not stop." The river became a killing ground. Men slipped, collided, disappeared beneath the surface. The sound of battle mixed with the roar of water, turning screams into something distant and unreal. Reaching the far bank, Artanes hauled himself up on shaking arms. Mud sucked at his boots. A Greek appeared above him, spear thrusting downward. Artanes raised his shield just in time, the impact numbing his arm. He rolled aside as another immortal cut the Greek down. Once more the line formed, wet, battered, relentless. Persian archers found their footing and returned fire. Arrows arced over the river, plunging into the palisade defenders. Wood splintered. Men fell back, shouting in alarm. Then the Immortals charged. The palisade shuddered under the impact of shields and bodies. Spears jabbed through gaps. Greek defenders fought desperately, stabbing downward, hurling stones. The air filled with grunts, curses, and the dull thud of flesh against wood. Artanes forced his way through a breach, tumbling into the enemy line. For a moment, everything dissolved into chaos. Faces too close, blades flashing in every direction. He struck, blocked, stumbled. Blood sprayed warm across his cheek. A Greek youth stood before him, no older than himself, eyes wide with terror. Their weapons hesitated mid-air. Then a shout broke the spell, and instinct took over. The youth fell, soundless. Artanes froze for half a heartbeat before the flow of battle dragged him onward. At last, the resistance cracked. Greek horns sounded the retreat. Men fled along the riverbank, abandoning the crossing to the Persians. The Immortals did not pursue far. They had learned caution. Victory without restraint was another kind of defeat. As evening fell, the river ran darker than before. The Immortals made camp on the far side, fires flickering as soaked armor steamed in the cooling air. The wounded were tended in silence. No cheers marked the victory, only the low murmur of men who had survived another day. Artanes sat by the water, scrubbing blood from his hands. It never seemed to fully come off. The veteran joined him, staring at the river's flow. "Empires are built on crossings like this," he said. "Rivers, walls, graves." Artanes watched the current carry debris downstream. Broken arrows, torn cloth, a lone helmet spinning slowly. "Will it ever end?" he asked. The older man did not answer right away. "It ends when the Empire decides it's taken enough," he said finally. "Not when the soldiers have." Night settled over the camp, heavy and quiet. Somewhere beyond the darkness, the Greeks were retreating again, wounded but unbroken. Artanes lay down on cold ground, listening to the river rush past, realizing that every step forward carried him deeper into a war that would demand more than strength. It would demand their souls. The days that followed blurred together into a single, grinding rhythm. March, skirmish, camp, repeat. Villages emptied at the Immortals' approach, doors left swinging, fires abandoned mid-meal. Sometimes there was resistance, desperate men with hunting spears, trembling behind low stone walls. Sometimes there was only silence. Silence, Artanes learned, was worse. It meant the enemy was watching. The Immortals moved deeper into hostile land, their supply lines stretching thin. Grain wagons lagged behind. Water grew harder to find. Each ration was counted, each decision weighed by officers who knew hunger could kill as efficiently as any spear. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, a scout collapsed into camp with terror in his eyes. "They're burning the fields," he gasped. "All of them." Miles ahead, a murmur rippled through the ranks. Scorched earth. The Greeks were denying the Persians food, forcing the army to live off what it carried, or starve. The immortal commanders gathered, voices low and urgent. Soon, orders spread. The army would divide. A detachment of immortals would strike ahead at night, seize the granaries of a nearby city, rumored to be supplying the resistance. Artanes found himself among those chosen. Night fell thick and moonless. Armor was wrapped in cloth to silence it. Faces were darkened with ash. The immortals moved like shadows, boots careful, breaths measured. Even the wind seemed to hold its voice. As they approached the city walls, the smell of smoke and grain filled the air. Torches flickered atop the battlements. Greek guards laughed softly, unaware of the death moving toward them. A whispered command. Then motion. Ropes flew upward. Grappling hooks bit into stone. Immortals climbed swiftly, silently. One guard turned too late, eyes widening before a hand clamped over his mouth. The body was lowered without a sound. Artanes crested the wall, heart pounding so loudly he feared it would betray him. Below, the city lay asleep, narrow streets winding between stone houses. The gates were the key. They moved fast now, blades flashing in torchlight. A shout rang out, too late. The gates were thrown open, and Persian troops surged inside like a flood. Chaos erupted. Fire leapt from roof to roof. Greek defenders scrambled half-armed, shouting orders that dissolved into panic. The immortals cut through resistance with brutal efficiency, their discipline terrifying in the close streets. Artanes burst into a granary, the air thick with dust and the sweet smell of grain. A Greek man stood between him and the stores, clutching a short sword, fear playing on his face. "This feeds my children," the man pleaded, voice shaking. Artanes hesitated. Then the veteran was beside him, blade already red. "And ours," he said quietly. The man fell. The grain was seized. By dawn, the city was under Persian control. Supplies were secured. The fires were allowed to burn themselves out, leaving blackened stone and smoke-stained skies. As the immortals withdrew, Artanes looked back at the city, at the bodies in the streets, at the people watching from shattered doorways with hatred in their eyes. Victory tasted bitter. When they returned to the main army, the mood was grim but relieved. Food was distributed. Strength returned to tired limbs. The march continued, yet something had changed. Around the campfires, men spoke less of glory and more of home. Some prayed. Some stared into the flames, lost in thoughts they could not voice. The veteran sharpened his blade in silence. "They'll remember this night," he said without looking up. "So will we." Artanes lay awake long after the fires died down. He understood now that war was not only fought on battlefields and rivers. It was fought in granaries, in streets, in the choices that stayed with man long after the fighting ended. And the immortals were learning that even an elite army could not escape the weight of what it took to conquer. Winter crept in quietly, not with storms but with cold mornings that stiffened fingers and slowed the march. Breath steamed inside helmets. Armor felt heavier, as if the metal itself resisted being worn again. The Greeks had withdrawn toward the coast, where the land narrowed and the sea offered both escape and reinforcement. Persian ships shadowed them offshore, sails pale against the gray horizon. The war had stretched into a contest of patience now. Who could endure longer? Who could supply their men when the land no longer could? One dawn, the sea spoke first. A lookout's cry cut through the camp. Shapes moved on the water. Greek triremes, low and fast, was biting the waves in perfect rhythm. Horns sounded along the Persian shoreline. Sailors scrambled. Marines grabbed shields and spears. Artanes watched from the bluff as the fleets closed. The sea churned, calm shattered by the thunder of ramming prows. Wood splintered. Men screamed as ships locked together, turning the water into a floating battlefield. Persian archers on deck loosed volleys, arrows skipping off waves or plunging into enemy crews. Greeks answered with javelins and stones, the air thick with flying death. Grappling hooks caught. Ships were pulled together. Boarding began. From shore it looked like chaos, but there was method even here. Persian marines surged forward in waves, shields raised, forcing space on the narrow decks. Greek sailors fought like trapped animals, every inch contested. A Persian ship rammed a Greek trireme amidships. The impact echoed across the water. The Greek vessel listed, then began to sink, dragging screaming men into the cold depths. Artanes felt his stomach twist. He had fought on land, in hills and streets, but this was different. There was no ground to retreat to, only water and death. The naval clash ended as abruptly as it began. Greek ships broke away, damaged and bloodied, retreating toward open sea. Persian losses floated behind them, wreckage bodies, shields bobbing like offerings to a merciless god. By midday, the Immortals were ordered forward along the coast. They found the aftermath where the land met the sea, wounded sailors dragged ashore, bodies laid in rows, salt-crusting blood-stained armor. The smell was unbearable. The Greeks did not wait. They attacked at dusk. A sudden rush from the dunes, shields up, voices raised in a desperate cry. This was no careful formation. This was fury. The Immortals barely had time to form ranks. Steel met steel. In the fading light, sand sprayed. Waves crashed behind them, indifferent. Artanes fought knee-deep in surf, water dragging at his legs. A Greek lunged, slipped, fell. Artanes struck without thinking. Another took his place immediately. A shout rose from the Persian rear. Warning, sharp and urgent. Greek reinforcements were coming by boat, landing behind the line. For the first time, the Immortals faced the threat of being cut off. Officers shouted commands, redirecting units with precision born of endless drills. The line bent and reformed, facing both sea and land. It was a killing ring. The fighting lasted until stars appeared overhead. At last, the Greeks withdrew again, dragging their wounded into the surf, disappearing into darkness. Silence returned, broken only by waves and labored breathing. Artanes dropped to his knees, water soaking his armor. His hands shook uncontrollably. He realized he was laughing, soft, broken. The veteran sat beside him, staring out at the Black Sea. "They throw everything at us now," he said, "because they know what we are." "What are we?" Artanes asked. The older man looked down at his bloodied hands. "The wall," he said, "and walls don't move. They just endure." As night deepened, the Immortals held the shoreline, battered but unbroken. Fires burned low. Ships creaked at anchor. Somewhere beyond the darkness, the Greeks planned their next move, and so did the Empire. The war was tightening, like a noose drawn slowly, patiently, around everyone caught within it. The noose tightened inland as well. With the coast secured, the Immortals were ordered to push toward the heart of the remaining resistance, an inland city ringed by stone walls and fed by mountain roads. It was a place that had refused envoys and executed messengers, a place that believed distance from the sea made it untouchable. The march toward it was slow and deliberate. Rain turned paths to mud. Wagons groaned. Men slipped and cursed under their breath. Each night, the wind carried the distant sound of bells from the city, warnings, prayers, defiance. When the walls finally rose before them, they were taller than expected. Stone stacked upon stone, weathered and stubborn. Banners hung limp in the cold air. The gates were shut tight. No challenge was issued. No surrender offered. The immortal commanders gave the signal. Siege engines rolled forward, their frames creaking like old trees. Archers took positions. Drums began again, slow, relentless. Stones flew. The first impacts echoed through the valley, dust bursting from the walls. Greek defenders answered with arrows and burning pitch. Fire streaked through the sky, splashing against shields and earth. Smoke rose thick and choking. Artanes took cover behind a shield wall, listening to the terrible rhythm of siege warfare. Thud, scream, crash. This was war stripped of motion, reduced to waiting and endurance. Days passed. At night, Greek voices drifted from the walls. Songs, insults, desperate prayers shouted into darkness. Persian campfires answered in silence. On the fourth night, orders came quietly. No drums. No horns. The Immortals moved before dawn, ladders carried low, feet muffled. Clouds hid the moon. The world felt small, held together by breath and nerve. Artanes climbed with the others, muscles screaming as his wounded leg protested. Above him, shadows shifted. A Greek guard leaned over the parapet, torch in hand. An arrow struck him soundlessly. He vanished. Hands grasped stone. Fingers found the top. Artanes rolled over the wall into chaos. Shouting erupted. Steel flashed. The Immortals surged like a living wave, cutting down defenders before alarms could spread. Gates were seized from within. Chains hacked apart. The gates opened. The army poured in. Street fighting followed, narrow, brutal, personal. Greek civilians fled screaming. Defenders fought from doorways, rooftops, stairwells. Every corner hid danger. Artanes kicked in the door and nearly lost his life to a falling axe. He stumbled back as a veteran buried his blade in the attacker's chest. "Eyes up!" the older man snapped. Always, the city broke by morning. Bodies lined the streets. Smoke curled from shattered homes. The remaining defenders laid down their arms, faces hollow with exhaustion and grief. The Immortals stood among the ruins, victorious. Yet no cheer rose. Artanes climbed the steps of a broken tower and looked out over the city. Children cried somewhere below. Old men knelt beside the dead. This victory would echo for generations, but not in songs the Persians would hear. The veteran joined him, leaning heavily on his spear. "They'll call us monsters," he said. Artanes nodded. "Will they be wrong?" The older man was silent for a long time. "History doesn't ask that," he said finally. "It only remembers who remain standing." As Persian banners were raised over the city, messengers rode out to carry the news across the empire. Another stronghold fallen. Another step toward submission. But among the Immortals, something had shifted. The certainty of purpose had begun to crack, replaced by a heavier understanding. They were winning, and each victory cost more than the last. The city became a wound the army could not ignore. For days, the Immortals remained inside its broken walls, securing roads, counting stores, tending to the injured. The air never fully cleared of smoke. Even when the fires died, the smell of ash lingered, clinging to skin and cloth. Greek prisoners were gathered in the central square, soldiers, not civilians. They were bound and guarded, faces hard with defeat. Some stared at the ground. Others stared back with open hatred. Artanes stood watch as officers questioned captives through interpreters. Names were taken, alliances mapped, routes traced in dust on stone. This war was being measured now, not in blood alone, but in information. One prisoner, older than the rest, met Artanes' eyes and spoke calmly. "You will win this land," the man said, "but you will never hold it." Artanes said nothing, but the words stayed with him. Orders soon followed. The Immortals would not linger. The king demanded movement, pressure on all fronts. Another army was advancing from the north. The Greeks were being squeezed. As they prepared to march again, word spread of a counterattack forming in the mountains. Greek forces, reinforced by allies, were gathering in a narrow pass. They meant to stop the Persians there, or die trying. The Immortals marched at once. The pass was a scar in the earth. Steep cliffs rising on either side, the road barely wide enough for formation. Cold wind screamed through it, carrying the smell of pine and stone. Artanes felt dread settle into his gut. This was ground that favored the defender, ground that could turn discipline into a liability. They advanced anyway. The first stones fell without warning. Boulders crashed down from above, smashing shields, crushing men into the road. Shouts echoed wildly, impossible to locate. Arrows followed, Greek shafts raining from unseen positions. The Immortals raised shields overhead, forming a moving shell, inching forward under relentless fire. "Forward!" officers shouted. "Do not stop." Men died without ever seeing their killers. Artanes moved mechanically, fear narrowing his world to the shield above him and the boots in front of him. His ears rang. Dust filled his mouth. Somewhere nearby, a man screamed until the sound cut off abruptly. Then the Greeks charged. They poured down from side paths, screaming, slamming into the Persian line with suicidal fury. The pass exploded into close combat. No room to maneuver, no retreat. Artanes was knocked to ground, shield torn from his grip. A Greek loomed over him. Spear raised. Artanes rolled aside just as it struck stone, then drove his dagger upward. The man collapsed onto him, heavy and lifeless. Hands dragged Artanes back to his feet. The veteran again, blood streaming from a gash in his forehead. "Together," he shouted, "or we die alone." The Immortals regrouped in the narrow space, locking shields, forming a wedge. Step by brutal step, they pushed forward, using discipline to carve order from chaos. Persian archers finally found angles, arrows arcing down from behind. Greek attacks faltered. Momentum slowed. At great cost, the Immortals forced their way through the pass. When it was over, the road was choked with bodies and broken stone. The cliffs stood silent, indifferent to the slaughter they had witnessed. Artanes sank down, hands trembling, chest heaving. He looked around at the survivors, faces hollow, eyes distant. The veteran sat beside him, breathing shallowly. "This is where legends die," he said softly, "and truth is born." Artanes stared at the blood-soaked ground, understanding fully for the first time. The Immortals were not invincible. They endured not because they could not be broken, but because they refused to break. As the army limped onward, leaving the past behind, the cost of empire lay scattered in the rocks. And still, the war demanded more. Beyond the pass, the land opened into a wide, battered plain. Snow dusted the distant hills, and the sky hung low and gray, as if pressing down on the survivors. The Immortals emerged from the stone corridor like men reborn, and like men who had left pieces of themselves behind. The march slowed. Wounds festered. Horses limped. Supplies dwindled again. Even the officers spoke less, their confidence worn thin by the relentless toll. One night, a fire broke out in the camp, not from enemy action, but from carelessness born of exhaustion. Tents went up in flames. Shouts echoed as men scrambled to save weapons and armor. By the time it was extinguished, 2 men were dead and more supplies were lost. No one blamed anyone. There was no strength left for anger. At dawn, a messenger arrived under a white cloth tied to his spear. A truce offering. Greek envoys followed, faces pale, eyes calculating. They proposed negotiations, borders, tribute, an end to the bloodshed. The immortal commanders listened in silence. The answer came swiftly. The war would continue. The Greeks left with tight jaws, knowing what refusal meant. They had hoped the past had broken the Persian will. It had only hardened it. Days later, the final confrontation began to take shape. Scouts reported a massive Greek force gathering near a fortified ridge. Hoplites from multiple city-states, mercenaries, remnants of earlier battles. This would not be a skirmish. This would decide everything. The Immortals prepared with grim efficiency. Armor was cleaned, repaired, donned one last time. Blades were sharpened until they whispered through the air. Artanes sat alone, staring at his spear. His reflection wavered in its polished head. Older now, harder. He thought of home, of a face he could barely remember clearly anymore. The veteran approached slowly, favoring one leg. "If I fall tomorrow," he said, "take my place in the line." Artanes looked up sharply. "You'll live," he said. It sounded like a prayer. The older man smiled faintly. "That's not how this works." The night before battle was unnaturally quiet. No songs, no boasting, just a crackle of fires and a low murmur of men speaking to gods they were no longer sure were listening. At first light, the armies faced each other. The Greek line stretched wide, shields overlapping. Spears angled forward like a wall of thorns. Banners snapped in the wind. Drums thundered from both sides, dueling rhythms that shook the ground. The Immortals advanced. Arrows flew, darkening the sky. Shields absorbed the storm. Men fell. The lines closed. Impact. The sound was immense, like the earth splitting. Spears shattered. Shields buckled. Men screamed and vanished beneath the press. Artanes fought without thought, moving as part of the whole. Strike. Block. Step. Again. Blood soaked the ground, turning dust to mud. The veteran fought beside him, relentless despite his wounds. For a moment, they stood back to back, fending off attackers. Then a Greek spear found its mark. Artanes heard the sound before he felt the absence, the dull, final thud. The veteran staggered, eyes wide, then fell. No! Artanes shouted, dropping to his knees. The older man grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Stand, he gasped. Be the line. His grip loosened. His eyes went still. Artanes rose. He stepped forward. The gap closed behind him. The Immortals pressed on, their discipline grinding down resistance inch by inch. By midday, the Greek line wavered. By afternoon, it broke. The field belonged to Persians. As the sun set, Artanes stood among the dead, spear planted in the ground, staring at nothing. The victory felt hollow, heavy. He had survived, and he understood now the true meaning of being immortal. Not living forever, but being replaced without pause, without memory. 10,000 again. Always. The battlefield was silent by morning, the kind of silence that rang in the ears. Fog clung low to ground, drifting over fallen shields and broken spears like a shroud. Crows gathered without fear, hopping between bodies, their cries sharp and impatient. Artanes stood watch as the dead were counted, not with numbers spoken aloud, but with movement. One body removed. One man steps forward. The line restored. 10,000. He no longer felt pride in it. Orders arrived before grief could settle. The Greeks had scattered, but not surrendered. Pockets of resistance remained in the hills, and cities still wavered between defiance and fear. The Immortals would move again. Their presence alone meant to crush any thought of rebellion. They marched through valleys scarred by earlier fighting. Graves lined the roads, Greek, Persian, unnamed. Farmers watched from a distance, eyes empty, calculating which empire would claim them next. In one town, the gates opened without a fight. Elders knelt in the dust, offering bread and salt, their hands shaking. The Immortals passed through in silence, accepting submission without cruelty, without kindness. That night, Artanes sat apart from the others, staring into the fire. The veteran's words echoed in his mind. Be the line. A young recruit approached hesitantly, armor still too clean, eyes too wide. Is it true, the boy asked, that we can't be defeated? Artanes looked at him for a long moment. No, he said finally, only that we keep going. The boy nodded, not fully understanding. News came days later that the Greek leadership had fractured. Some city-states sought terms. Others prepared for last stands. The empire tightened its grip, choosing where to strike and where to wait. The Immortals were sent to enforce the decisions. At a hilltop village, resistance flared suddenly, arrows from rooftops, stones hurled from walls. The Immortals responded with swift, brutal precision. The fight was over within an hour. Artanes found himself standing over a fallen defender, a man with gray in his beard and fury still in his eyes. The man spat blood and laughed. You win battles, he said, but you teach us how to hate you. Artanes turned away, unable to answer. Winter deepened. Snow fell heavy, muting sound, covering scars. Marches became slower, harder. Men slipped and cursed, breath ragged in the cold. One night, Artanes dreamed of the river crossing again, of water pulling him under, armor dragging him down. He woke gasping, heart pounding, the dream clinging like ice. Around him, other men slept fitfully, murmuring, twitching. Immortals all, haunted by the same ghosts. When dawn came, a messenger arrived with long-awaited news. The main Greek resistance had collapsed. The remaining cities would submit or be dealt with in time. The war for the Immortals was ending. There were no cheers. As they turned back toward the heart of the empire, Artanes looked once more over the lands they had conquered. Fields lay empty. Roads were lined with markers of death. Victory had come, but it wore the face of loss. The Immortals marched on, disciplined as ever. But inside, many had already paid the full cost of immortality. The return march was quieter, slower, almost mournful. Snow crunched under boots, and the cold seeped through even the thickest layers of leather and bronze. Rivers had frozen, hiding the evidence of past battles beneath opaque ice. The landscape seemed hollow, stripped of life and laughter. Artanes walked among men whose faces were drawn and pale. Some limped, others bore scars so fresh they still oozed. Silence clung heavier than the fog, broken only by the occasional cough or the distant call of a bird braving the winter. Orders came from the commanders to sweep through the remaining villages along the route, ensuring no hidden pockets of resistance remained. The Immortals obeyed without hesitation, but the look in their eyes was different, emptier, haunted by the ghosts they could not leave behind. Artanes entered a small village that had been spared destruction. Children peered from behind doors, curious but terrified. Women moved silently, offering what little food they had, their eyes pleading. A man stepped forward, holding a small bundle of grain. The veteran beside Artanes muttered, "Even these people fear us, and rightly so." Artanes knelt, accepting the offering with a nod. He said nothing. Words had no meaning here. Only presence, only the relentless reminder of the Empire. That night, the camp was set near the banks of a partially frozen river. Men huddled around fires, tending wounds, sharpening blades, whispering prayers or curses. Artanes found himself staring into the river's dark water, recalling the first crossing months ago. How small, how insignificant they had felt then, how much blood had flowed since. The veteran approached, leaning heavily on his spear. "You've changed," he said softly. "I see it in your eyes." Artanes shook his head. "We all have. There's no returning to who we were." The older man nodded. "No, only forward, or the river takes you." The wind carried distant echoes, perhaps wolves, perhaps voices. Men slept uneasily, but no true rest came. The Immortals had learned too much about death to ignore it. It clung to them like a shadow, silent but persistent. By dawn, the march resumed. Snow made every step more exhausting. Each man carried not only weapons and armor, but memories heavier than any pack. Villages passed without incident. Roads curved around forests and hills, leading inexorably toward the heart of the Empire. Artanes glanced at the soldiers around him. Some had become friends. Others were names he would never recall. All bore the same invisible weight. They were immortals, yes, but the cost of that immortality had left them hollow in ways no armor could protect. A horn sounded ahead. Officers gathered, studying maps, pointing at towns and rivers. New orders, new movements, new calculations. The war might be ending, but service to the Empire never did. Artanes gripped his spear tighter, letting it anchor him to the present. He no longer thought of glory or honor, only survival, only endurance, only the slow, unyielding march of men trained to be the living wall of an empire that demanded everything and gave back nothing. And as the Immortals continued onward, the snow falling steadily around them, Artanes realized that the real battles, the ones that haunted a man's mind and soul, were only beginning to unfold. By midwinter, the army had reached the outskirts of the final Greek stronghold, an ancient city perched atop jagged cliffs overlooking the sea. The cliffs themselves seemed to challenge any who dared approach, sharp stone jutting into the gray sky, waves crashing into their base with relentless fury. From a distance, the city appeared almost untouched, as if it had been holding its breath for months, waiting for the Immortals to arrive. Artanes and the others stood at the base of cliffs, surveying the defenses. Catapults crouched behind walls, armed and ready. Archers were visible along the battlements, thin lines of spears catching what little sunlight broke through the overcast sky. The air smelled of salt and stone, a bitter reminder that the sea could not always be controlled, no matter how many ships patrolled it. Orders came from the commanders with crisp precision. Engineers would construct ramps along the cliffside. Archers would provide cover. Infantry would storm the gates once the ramps were secure. Every man knew his place, every move calculated, yet the tension was tangible. Artanes tightened his grip on his spear, looking around at the faces of those marching beside him. Each was older than their years suggested, eyes hardened, hands scarred. None spoke. Words would have been wasted on fear or doubt. Only action mattered. As the Immortals began the ascent, Greek archers rained fire down upon them. Arrows whistled past, finding armor and flesh alike. Artanes raised his shield, shoving forward despite the slippery stone and the weight of his injuries. The climb was merciless, each step a battle, each breath a labor. Some fell, sliding into the jagged rocks below. Some caught by comrades' hands, pulled back into the line. The veteran beside him fought silently, his eyes scanning for threats, his body moving with the efficiency of decades of experience. Halfway up, a boulder tumbled loose from above, smashing into the ranks. Men screamed. Others scrambled to push it aside, using shields to deflect smaller stones. Artane's shoulder was bruised from a glancing blow, but he pressed on. Pain had become irrelevant. Survival, discipline, and the relentless will of the Empire were all that mattered. Finally, they reached the base of the city walls. Ropes were thrown, ladders secured. Immortals surged upward, shields raised, weapons flashing. The defenders met them with steel and fury, desperate to prevent the breach. The clash was immediate and intimate. Metal against metal, cries of pain and rage filling the narrow stone streets. Artanes fought as if possessed, striking down any who came near, stepping over bodies without pause. Around him, the Immortals moved as one living instrument of war, disciplined and unyielding. Slowly, the defenders began to falter. Hours passed. The walls were taken, the gates breached. Greek soldiers either surrendered or fell. The city was silent except for cries of the wounded and the low murmur of Immortals ensuring order. Artane stood atop a wall, looking out over the city below, now in Persian hands. Smoke rose from the battlements, mingling with the gray winter sky. The sea beyond glimmered cold and indifferent. Victory had been achieved, but at what cost? The veteran approached, bloodied and exhausted. "This is the last," he said, voice strained. "For now." Artanes nodded, but the weight of all that had been endured pressed on him. Faces of fallen comrades and enemies alike lingered in his mind. He realized that the Empire's reach was secure, but nothing would ever wash away the memories carved into the snow, the stone, and the bloodied earth. Even as they prepared to secure the city and send word of its fall to the Empire, Artanes understood that survival was no longer measured by living through battle. It was measured by carrying its burden day after day, in the quiet moments that followed. The war was ending, but its shadow would remain forever. The days after the capture of the city were filled with a grim routine. Immortals patrolled the streets, inspecting fortifications, organizing supply lines, and ensuring no spark of rebellion remained. Fires were extinguished, barricades dismantled, traps disarmed. The Greek population, though subdued, watched from doorways, eyes wary and full of resentment. Artanes walked among them silently, observing without comment. Children huddled behind mothers. Older men held themselves stiffly, refusing to meet his gaze. Every face told the same story. Fear, anger, and the knowledge that the Empire's shadow was long and unrelenting. At night, the Immortals gathered in small groups around fires, sharing rations, tending wounds, and whispering prayers or curses into the darkness. Artane sat apart, staring at the embers, remembering the past, the river, the streets of conquered towns, the bodies of friends and enemies alike. Each image burned itself into memory unbidden. The veteran joined him, voice quiet against the crackle of the fire. "We have done what few could, and yet he let the sentence hang." Artanes didn't finish it for him. The truth was already there. Victory never erased the cost. Every battle, every city taken, every life ended or broken, had left an imprint. Even the Immortals were not untouched by it. Scouts returned with news that Greek resistance in the northern hills had collapsed. The scattered remnants had either surrendered or fled beyond reach. The campaign, for all its blood and fire, was complete. Yet Artanes could feel no triumph, only exhaustion and a gnawing emptiness. The army began to march back toward the core of the Empire, moving through winter roads slick with ice and mud. Villages along the route offered food and shelter, but there was no celebration. People had seen enough war to know that submission did not guarantee safety, only a temporary reprieve. Artanes thought of the men who had fallen beside him. The boy from the river, the veteran at the pass, countless others whose names he would never speak aloud. Their absence was a quiet, ever-present ache, a weight he could not put down. One evening, as they camped near a frozen river, the veteran spoke again. "We are immortals," he said, "not because we cannot die, but because we endure, because we take the place of those who cannot, again and again. This is our legacy." Artanes nodded, staring into the reflection of the fire in the river's dark water. He saw the lines in his own face, the scars that would not heal, the haunted eyes of men who had been through too much to ever be the same. He understood that endurance had a cost, and that cost was often invisible to those who only saw the victories. The army moved on the next morning, leaving the frozen river behind. Silence accompanied them as heavily as armor, and Artanes walked among his comrades with the knowledge that the empire had expanded, but the men who served it carried the true weight of conquest. Every step, every march, every victory was etched into their bodies and minds. They had achieved what few could, but survival was not triumph. It was the beginning of carrying the consequences, always forward, never forgotten. Artanes tightened his grip on his spear and pressed on. The Immortals would endure as they always had. But inside him and in all those who had survived, a quiet understanding had taken root. No glory could erase what they had seen, what they had done, or the emptiness that remained. The return toward the heart of the empire stretched over weeks, a slow, relentless journey through snow-covered plains and frozen forests. The soldiers moved like shadows, their armor dulled by dust, ice, and the faint rust of battle. Even the wind seemed subdued, carrying only the whisper of their passage. Artanes noticed how the landscape itself seemed to mourn the war. Villages were scarred, fields untended, forests trampled. Occasionally, they passed small memorials, a mound of stones for a fallen family, a hastily carved cross, a burnt-out hearth. The reminders were everywhere, subtle yet undeniable, of lives interrupted, futures stolen. The Immortals maintained formation, though morale was frayed. Conversations were rare, limited to commands or short observations. Some men hummed quiet prayers under their breath. Others stared at the snow, lost in thoughts too heavy to speak aloud. One afternoon, scouts brought news that a small contingent of Greek refugees was attempting to regroup in the mountains, hoping to find safety among allies. The Immortals were ordered to intercept. Artanes and a detachment were sent ahead, moving silently through dense trees, the sound of snow crunching beneath boots masking their advance. When they found the group, the Greeks were exhausted, poorly armed, and desperate. Women and children clung to the few men left, eyes wide with terror. Artanes hesitated. The veteran beside him did not. The Immortals struck with efficiency. Some fled into the forest. Others were taken prisoner. Artanes looked down at the survivors they had captured, their faces pale and trembling. One young boy, no older than 12, met his gaze. Artanes could see the same fear and hatred he had seen in so many eyes before. The veteran placed a hand on his shoulder. "They will remember," he said quietly, "and we will remember them." Artanes nodded but said nothing. Memory had become a heavy burden, stitched into every step, every swing of the spear, every breath drawn in battle. He understood now that immortality was not about escaping death. It was about carrying the weight of countless lives, both friend and foe, without faltering. As night fell, the Immortals camped in the trees, fires small and controlled. The stars shone coldly overhead, indifferent to the suffering below. Artanes sat apart from the others, staring at the darkness, thinking of all the towns they had passed, all the cities taken, all the men who would never return a hearth or home. The veteran sat beside him, silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "We will go home, but we will not be the same. The empire grows, but the cost stays with us." Artanes turned toward him, seeing the truth in his eyes, the weight of survival, of victory, of endless war. It forged him into something beyond mere soldiers. They were mortals, yes, but immortality carried no joy, only endurance. The fires flickered in the cold night as the army prepared to move again at dawn. Artanes rose, spear in hand, shoulders squared. He would endure as he always had. But deep inside, he knew the battles of the mind and the soul would follow him far longer than any clash of swords, long after the war had ended. And so, the Immortals continued, step by painstaking step, through snow, silence, and shadow, carry with them the unspoken cost of empire. Spring began to thaw the frozen plains as the Immortals neared the heart of the empire. The snow melted into sluggish streams, carving dark lines through the earth, carrying with it the memory of the battles fought in winter's cold. Trees sprouted tentative buds. Birds returned, their songs fragile against a backdrop of devastation. Life, it seemed, persisted even after death had walked so heavily across the land. Artane's marched with the others, shoulders stiff, body scarred, mind crowded with ghosts. The veteran walked beside him, leaning on a spear that had seen more battles than either could count. The campaign was over, yet the soldiers carried with them the echoes of every clash, every city, every river crossing where friends had fallen and enemies had died in equal measure. When they entered the capital, the streets were filled with the banners of the empire, welcoming the victorious army. Citizens lined the roads, cheering, clapping, waving offerings of food and drink. But Artane saw none of it. The applause sounded hollow, distant, as if it belonged to someone else. The Immortals had survived, yes, but they had paid for that survival in ways the Empire would never understand. Orders were given to quarter the soldiers, repair the roads, and report the fallen. The veterans were commended, the young soldiers praised. Artanes accepted no such accolades. His eyes sought the faces of the men who had marched beside him, whose names were now carved into memory and grave markers alike. Survival, he realized, was its own reward, and a cruel one. In the quiet of the evening, Artanes walked alone along the ramparts. Below him, the city hummed with life, unaware of the silent cost of its expansion. He recalled every river, every pass, every wall they had stormed. Each moment lingered, etched into his flesh and mind. The Immortals had been tested beyond endurance, and though they had survived, their hearts bore wounds invisible to any observer. The veteran joined him finally, gaze fixed on the horizon. "Do you see it?" he asked softly. "The Empire stands stronger, but at what price?" Artane said nothing at first, then whispered, "The cost is ours, always ours." They stood in silence, watching the sun set, painting the city in shades of gold and crimson, a fragile beauty over the scars of conquest. The Immortals had carried the Empire forward, shaping history with discipline, courage, and unyielding resolve. Yet the lesson endured beyond victory. Glory was fleeting, and every triumph bore the weight of sacrifice. Artanes turned to ascend into the city, knowing that life would continue. Wars would come again, new cities would rise and fall, and the Empire would demand more. He understood now that the true immortality of the soldiers was not in surviving the battles, but in enduring the memory of them, bearing the unending cost so that the Empire could endure. And as night fell over the capital, the Immortals rested not in triumph, but in quiet, enduring acknowledgement of all they had lost, all they had taken, and all they had survived. Their legacy would be written in stone, blood, and memory, and it would endure long after their voices had faded into history.